So with the idea of customization in mind, the first aspect of Liferay that we're going to be customizing is going to be the user interface. But before we do, let's take a look at some of the technologies and get a little bit of idea of what the user interface of Liferay looks like and how it's built. So let's take a look. So we're first going to be talking about the web interface of Liferay. There are other user interfaces of Liferay, such as creating a native mobile application for Liferay, as well as a desktop client. Our example that we have is Liferay Sync. So starting off with the web user interface and some of the technologies that we use in order to create the web UI. So as we've seen with our discussion about portlets, a lot of the applications that we build primarily use portlets and more specifically JSPs. Now, on top of using JSPs, Liferay also has a couple of frameworks behind the scenes that help us out. The big ones are known as Lexicon and Clay. Also, we have a couple of Java frameworks that we're able to use as well. Liferay has Alloy UI and Metal.js. Metal.js is built with jQuery in mind, so we also have the ability to use jQuery. And there's a lot of other tag libraries behind the scenes that we can leverage and use within our UI. Now let's go ahead and talk about Lexicon and Clay and kind of what they are. So we're first going to start off with Lexicon. Lexicon is more or less a design language. If you look within our documentation, we ourselves call it an experience language. The idea behind a design or an experience language is that within the specification, it basically defines what things should look like. A button in Liferay should look like this, an icon in Liferay should look like that, and define some other things like which colors are the colors we prefer in Liferay, and how do we make things kind of look and feel like Liferay. So it gives us the ideas, it gives us the patterns, as well as the tools to be able to follow the design language specified by Lexicon. Now, Lexicon, for example, determines what does a form box look like. A box in Liferay should look something like this, and Lexicon will define all of the specifications or the nitty-gritty details. So this is what Lexicon does. Just defines how things should look. Now, we don't leave you guys, to implement these things on your own. This is where Clay comes into play. So Lexicon says a button should look like this. Clay will give you the code for what Lexicon defines. Or in other words, Lexicon is implemented using Clay. So Clay is the implementation of Lexicon. So it'll actually give you the specific code for what we define over in Lexicon. And Clay is built using your classic HTML, CSS, JavaScript, kind of what we know to be the building blocks of the front end. Right. On top of that, Clay also extends Twitter Bootstrap and jQuery. So again, we can use jQuery all throughout the user interface or the UI of Liferay. So some examples here. So Lexicon would say a dropdown should look like this. Clay will actually give you the code to implement the dropdown defined by Lexicon. Right. So if you want more information, if you want to read up on, the actual design language, we have a URL for Lexicon. And if you want to take a look at the actual implementation, we have the URL for Clay. So these two are very good resources for us to gain an understanding of how the front end of Liferay is built, as well as how should we customize the front end given the design language, Lexicon, and our implementation using Clay. Now, next up is Alloy UI. And if you've come from previous versions of Liferay, you would have heard of Alloy UI. But Alloy UI is our original UI framework that we built quite some time ago, and it was built on Yahoo's YUI. If you guys kept up with the YUI scene, one of the things that happened with YUI is it basically reached its end of life. There is no further development of YUI. And so what we have done is we are the ones basically supporting Alloy UI for the time being, but it is technically deprecated moving forward. But with that being said, you are still able to use Alloy UI, and in fact, you may even see it along the way. So this is why we're covering it. Even though it's kind of a part of the past, it's still following us today. It's still supported in the sense of you can still use it. Okay, so Alloy UI. So there are some cool things that you can do with Alloy UI, like making a simple drop-down using some code determined from Alloy UI, and then you can add some JavaScript behind the scenes to, make it do stuff. So if you are curious about Alloy UI and some of the details of it, we have a URL that brings us over to our Alloy UI website. So at the time Alloy UI was reaching its deprecation, when YUI reached its own end of life, we kind of had to do some things to remedy the situation. And so we added support with jQuery for Alloy UI, and at the same time we introduced and started developing another UI framework or JavaScript framework called Metal.js. So let's go ahead and talk about Metal.js a little bit more. So Metal.js is the new JavaScript framework that we have here within Liferay. Again, the big response to YUI being deprecated was the creation of Metal.js. The key aspects of Metal.js is the idea of having the ability to use soy templates as well as JSX, the Facebook templating language. So you can use soy templates, JSX, in order to help customize your front end. On top of that, Metal.js is also supporting ECMAScript 2015 and ECMAScript 6, in other words. We also have server-side rendering, isomorphic support, and the AMD loader support as well. So some examples that we have of Metal.js using a soy template can be seen here. Again, since this really isn't a front-end developer course, we're not going to dive into too much detail of Metal.js and what we're talking about, but it is really good to know since a lot of what we're going to be working with in the front end does involve these technologies. So if you want more info, we have a couple of links here, right, to the actual documentation of Metal.js, as well as some tutorials if you want to get your hands a little bit dirty with Metal.js. So let's go ahead, we'll recap here really quick. Even though Alloy UI is technically deprecated, there's still a lot of Alloy UI code throughout Liferay. So we're going to be seeing that as well as how to use it, right? But as time moves on, we are favoring Metal.js, and it's going to be heavily used within our applications as we progress through, month by month, year by year of Liferay. And just like what we talked about with developing for the back end of Liferay, there is sort of a idea of being framework agnostic, in the sense of, if you want to use React or Angular or any of the cool JavaScript frameworks that you prefer to use, then by all means, feel free to do so. Right? A lot of preference, and you have the ability to pick and choose which frameworks you want. But in this course, we're going to highlight the ones that we at Liferay have developed and are using. Right. So again, more info, feel free to head over to Liferay's documentation. Now let's move on to tag libraries and take a look at some of the tag libraries that we're going to be using quite often within the front end of Liferay. Now, Liferay itself has a bunch of tag libraries that we're able to use that are fully integrated with Liferay. So some of the common things that we may create are over in these tag libraries. Right? With these tag libraries, it also helps us create our UI in a responsive way. So if you're on a desktop and you check out your site on a mobile application, right, the site will adjust to the resolution that's available. And we want consistency as well. If we're building different sites for different platforms, where we want this uniform feel, right? We don't want a button to look different from one perspective or another. So tag libraries helps us create that very consistent look and feel as well. Some common tag libraries that we have here, right? We'll highlight a couple of them. The AUI, for example, allows us to use Alloy UI tag libraries. The portlet, right? This allows us to use portlet-specific attributes, as we've seen previously with things such as the portlet render URL, portlet action URL. Liferay UI allows us to use some components, not OSGI components, but Liferay specific components within our UI. Things like a container to store things, like in a grid, for example. And we have a couple of other ones that we're going to be playing with a little bit more. And so with all of that being said, let's take a look at the overview once again of what it's going to look like to customize the UI. So we have an idea of the technologies we can use. Let's take a look at, well, how do we want to customize the UI or the front end of Liferay? Let's start off with the most broad, right? Maybe you have launched your Liferay site, but you want to completely change the experience, right? The headers, the footer, right? Your navigation bar, the background image, and so on and so on. One of the easiest ways that you have to do this is through a theme covered in a completely different course. But a theme is a very powerful tool to kind of rebrand Liferay to make it look like your own branding. Now, taking a look at the more developer backend centric ways, we have things such as creating templates. One of the primary templates that we have are known as application display templates. Helps us configure the way an application displays its content. Some of the more iffy ways or legacy or deprecated ways are kind of further below. We have these things called core JSP overrides. While very powerful, technically deprecated. We also have ways in which we can override the JSPs within a bundle that is also technically deprecated. Now, the two ways that are more safe are the API based that we see towards the bottom. So we have ways of safely overriding the JSPs using these things called dynamic includes and portlet filters. So we'll kind of hit different aspects of what we see here and take a look at a couple of different examples. So with all that being said, let's take a look at some of the ways in which we're able to customize the front end or the UI of Liferay.